Hello to all my friends in Italy. It's such a pleasure to be with you at Book City, Milano, and thank you so much for the invitation. Well, the situation in the world is grim, but there is hope. The viruses are going to keep coming. We're going to have more pandemics. We need to get used to that. When my dad was born in 1908, 85% of this planet was still wild. No humans, no development. Today, only 25% of the wilderness is still there. And by the mid part of the century, we may lose it all. So the viruses are now climate migrants. They are migrating because the wilderness is now receding and getting closer to our highly dense urban populations. So this is not going to go away. And also now the climate is rewilding. I don't have to say this to all of you. Everybody in the world in the last 2 years has come to understand climate change is no longer a future. It's here now, every day, every week, every month. And even if we reduce our global warming emissions to near zero, which we have to do, we are moving to a new climate that'll be here for millennia and millennia to come, unlike the climate we have known since hominids and Homo sapiens have been on this planet. And let me explain what climate change is all about. Climate change changes the water cycle of the Earth. We have four major spheres on the planet. We have the hydrosphere, the waters, the lithosphere, the soil, the plants, the animals. We have the atmosphere, the oxygen, and then the biosphere, which encompasses it all. These are the animating spheres of the planet, but the waters, the hydrosphere, is the key mover. This is the watery planet. So for every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature is going up on this planet from global warming gases, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground into the clouds. So we're getting more precipitation in the clouds and more violent water events, massive winter snows and frigid temperatures. Then in the spring, we're getting flooding across every continent for months. And in the summer, we're getting droughts all over the summer and heat waves and massive wildfires. And in the fall, we're getting hurricanes and typhoons. This water cycle, the hydrological cycle, is rewilding and taking us into a new climate. And the last time we experienced anything like this was 2.5 million years ago. Hominids have only been here 800,000 years. Homo sapiens over only 200,000 years. So our scientists are telling us we are now in the sixth extinction of life on Earth. There have been 5 mass extinctions before us, and they were millions of years ago. Last one was 65 million years ago. Very fast die out, millions a year to get new life on the planet. We're in the 6th extinction now. And our scientists are telling us, I want every parent to hear this, and every young person having a family, we may lose over half the species on this earth in the lifetime of today's babies. We are in trouble. How did we get here? How did we get to an extinction event? It isn't just about the fossil fuels. It's about much more than that. I'm going to take us back in time to how our species took this planet to a potential extinction and what we need to do to be able to chart a new course to survive and maybe even flourish in new ways, in a completely different way to live on this earth. It all goes back to the first historical document, the book of Genesis in the Bible, thousands of years ago. And in the book of Genesis, the Lord says to Adam and Eve, you ate the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I told you not to do it. I'm going to expel you from the garden, and you're going to have to live by your labor. But I'm going to give you, Adam, a gift. You shall have dominion in all of your heirs over all the living things on the earth. That mandate has kept with us in various forms, in religious forms and ideological forms, all through history. And it culminated in the age of progress in the last 2 centuries of the industrial age. In 1794, the aristocrat Nicolas de Condorcet, who was a revolutionary, was being hunted down by the French Republic radicals, and they wanted to guillotine him. So in a moment, he actually penned a little essay, and he said, human perfection is inevitable, and we will see progress as long as the globe is here. So that began the age of progress, the last 2 centuries of the industrial age, and that's what's taken us finally, after all these thousands of years, to the final abyss that we now have to make sure we don't cross. And here's the big unspoken. What's caused this? It's all the set of assumptions, the narratives, the worldview, the policies, and the practices of the age of progress, the last 2 centuries, that's taken us to extinction. It's the way we conceive of economic life. It's how we organize our governance. It's our relationship to nature. It's our approach to scientific inquiry. It's how we educate our children. It's even how we perceive our selfhood. It's all of these ideas that's taken a long time, thousands of years, that have culminated in the age of progress. And now it's those very assumptions that are taking us to the brink of extinction, and we're using those same set of assumptions to try to cure the process that created them. So where do we go from here? We don't have a playbook, but the young Gen Z generation and millennials, they're beginning to understand what's going on. I think what we're all beginning to realize, and this is only in the last 2 years with all these climate disasters now in real time for all of us, we're beginning to realize that this planet we live in all of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, these great spheres, this planet is much more powerful than we ever thought. And our little species is much smaller and less significant in the evolutionary scheme of things on Earth. The Earth does not need us. This is a huge shift in consciousness after thousands of years in the Western civilization believing that we are to be the masters of nature. I should say, for a moment, the Eastern religions and philosophies were very different. Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and even Confucianism, the philosophy, they saw nature very differently. And that is that every human being is part of nature and must adapt to nature and have harmony with nature because there's no separation. Humans are part of the natural world. Have they strayed in the East? Yes, especially in the 20th century, but it's still at least in their cultural DNA. We may come back to that. So then, what's the next step for us? When I began this book 9 years ago, I began with thinking the great changes in history are when we change our infrastructures. Now, most people think of infrastructure as bridges and roads and things of that nature. They're more important. Every great infrastructure paradigm in history, and there's been 7 or 8, bring together new forms of communication, new sources of energy, new modes of mobility and logistics, so that large numbers of people can come together and relate to each other as a social organism to communicate power and move their day-to-day life. And these infrastructures allow us to create habitats, and these infrastructures create the economic systems that go with them. They determine what kind of economic systems are compatible, and these infrastructures determine what kind of governance is compatible, and these infrastructures determine what kind of worldview we inherit. Which is quite interesting. None of this is in a textbook, but this is the way the anthropology works. And infrastructures are really social organisms. Every cell, every body has to have a means to communicate, some source of power and energy to stay alive, and it has to have some kind of mobility or motility to make it. And it has to have a semi-permeable membrane, a habitat, a skin, a shell, whatever. So given that, then the question is, what has led to this current crisis? All right, why are we where we are now? Each of these infrastructures change our temporal spatial orientation. Now, this might be a surprise to everybody, but our temporal orientation in history was very different than today. All of us today believe in efficiency, right? We think that's always the way human beings were. No, this is an anomaly, efficiency, to the modern age, the age of progress. For all of our species, life on this planet, 200,000 years of Homo sapien, 800,000 years of hominids, we did what every other species did temporally. All of our species have biological clocks in our cells, our bodies, our tissues, and our organs, myriad biological clocks. Every moment they are adjusting and adapting to what's going on in the outside world. The rotation of the planet every day from sunlight to dark, the tidal and lunar rhythms every month, the circadian rhythms as our planet moves across the sun and daylight changes every day. So we are constantly, like every other species, our biological clocks are adapting. The temporal value in all species is to adapt to the changes that are occurring moment to moment in the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. We're constantly adapting, anticipating and adapting. In the modern age, and especially the age of progress, we turned this around. And instead of adapting our species to nature, like we always did over the history, we began adapting nature to our species. And that's where we turned the corner that now led to an extinction event. So what is the temporal value? It's called efficiency. Very strange. Has nothing to do with nature. In nature, adaptivity is the temporal value, and efficiency is the value for factory and industrial production in our current way of life. Efficiency is extracting larger volumes of the Earth's spheres, the water, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the soil, the plants, the trees, the animals, the atmosphere, the oxygen, extracting greater volumes of the Earth's spheres in higher speeds and shorter time intervals. That's what efficiency is about. Then we wonder why we depleted the Earth in 200 years, all right? Nature doesn't operate by efficiency. It doesn't. It operates by adaptivity. Every species temporally adapting to every other species in the rotation of the planet and our movement around the sun, and constantly adapting to all the little changes. There's a twin. Efficiency has a twin called productivity. Productivity is measuring the outputs in relation to the inputs you put in, right? Well, nature doesn't operate by productivity. There's no such thing. Nature operates by regenerativity. The more it's regenerativity is how nature flourishes. And while I use that term, let me explain that. We talk about growth. In nature, there's no talk about growth. It's about flourishing, which is a biological concept. And so we're moving from growth to flourishing and from productivity to regenerativity if we can learn that we are part of the ecosystems of the Earth. That's our ticket, if you will, to develop an age of resilience. So then there's a concept of space. And our spatial relationship is very interesting. For all of our history, we saw space as a commons that allowed us to nourish life, all right? But in the modern age, in the age of progress, we began to see space as passive resources. And the French physiocrats had it right. The first economist said, wait a minute, space is really where photosynthesis occurs and net primary production. That's the wealth of the planet. But then the British economists came along and they said, well, nature's waste. It's doing nothing. It's valueless. And John Locke, the great political philosopher, said, nature only becomes valuable when we add human labor and create capital. Well, now a younger generation is saying, well, no, finance capital isn't the abundance, the wealth of the planet. It's ecological capital. That's now changing. And what we're beginning to see is a younger generation, not only in the business community, but in all walks of life, is beginning to discuss a new business model that's starting to emerge into the economic life of the planet. So let me just give you this list that our team, we have a global team that's been working for a long time with governments, especially European governments, the European Union, China, and more recently the U.S. government, the U.S. Senate. And over the period of time, we've been looking at all the changes going on as we move to what's called a third industrial revolution infrastructure. The coming together of digital communication, internet, with a digital energy internet, so people can generate solar and wind where they live, share the surplus across time zones, oceans, and the planet, and a transportation and mobility internet made up of electric and vehicle transport, powered by solar and wind from the electricity internet, using big data, analytics, and algorithms to share autonomous transport on road, rail, water, and air, just like we use that data and analytics to share solar and wind electricity across the time zones of the world. And we use analytics and algorithms and big data to share our communication on the energy internet. We are bringing the world together in a digitized brain and nervous system. The brain is Galileo, GPS, these big satellites, and they connect to the nervous system, which are billions and soon trillions of sensors that are monitoring the world for us. And so they're telling us what's going on moment to moment in the climate. They're monitoring wildlife. They're looking at soil composition. They're in factories and agricultural fields and smart homes measuring electricity, etc. And this third industrial revolution infrastructure is quite interesting because it's the last of the industrial revolutions. I first used the term third industrial revolution in 1995 in a book called The End of Work. But at that time, we did not imagine that over a period of time, this third industrial revolution would metamorphose into something beyond the industrial age by mid-century. We only found that out later. And we knew the third industrial revolution started with computers back in the 1950s. We're 70 years in. But what we're finding out as we work with governments and industry, as this distributed third industrial revolution infrastructure moves in, it's metamorphosing into something that by 2050 will be what we would call a resilient infrastructure for a resilient age. So let me just share with you some of these changes and see if it resonates with you. A younger generation is pivoting from the idea of growth to the idea of flourishing. Flourishing is what nature does, not growth. A younger generation is moving from finance capital to ecological capital. The real wealth is photosynthesis, all right? A younger generation is moving from productivity to regenerativity. Nature is about regenerativity. A younger generation is understanding that you can't be lean, that ecosystems are diverse. The more diverse the ecosystem, the more resilient. The more monocultures an ecosystem, the more it's vulnerable to collapse. Same with big global companies. The more centralized, the more vertical, the more stodgy they are, and they're not agile enough to move with ecosystems. So you need smart, small and medium-sized, high-tech SMEs in cooperatives that are fluid and agile, so you can have a wide diversity of business opportunities around the world that can change all the time and have agility. We're moving from seller-buyer markets to provider-user networks. If you, for example, let me tell you an example. An architect, Cucinelli, he's an Italian architect. He 3D printed a home with fabricated printing using clay, soil. So they heat up the soil, they have software, and then that fluid soil is taken by the software, and they print out layer by layer the house. It's called additive manufacturing. They can build the house in 200 hours. Some of them go as little as 24 hours. They're passive, they're zero emission, they're resilient. So what he can do is he can take the software for that house, and he can take that software and send it to a developer in the Philippines in a provider-user network, not a seller-buyer market, and that user provides a licensing fee while he's using it. This takes us from globalization to glocalization, a more distributed planet with the new digital technology, and that's beyond the kind of economic model we've known in capitalist and socialist countries. It's much more distributed. It goes in tandem with the planet. We don't waste a lot of energy on ocean traffic and far removed logistic chains that are very, very vulnerable to climate disasters and cyber terrorist attacks. We are moving from intellectual property rights to open source sharing of knowledge. Young people don't want to pay for knowledge. They want to share it on the internet. We're moving from zero-sum games, that's the old worldview, to network effects. The more people in the network, the more everyone benefits for the network. It's not win or lose, it's sharing. We're moving from globalization, as I just said, to glocalization. And we're moving from geopolitics for the fossil fuel industrial age and big military establishments to biosphere politics. We're sharing the sun and the wind. They're free. We don't need a military because everyone has sun and wind. And when it's sunny in one time zone in the world, we're going to be able to go up on a global energy internet, which is already emerging, and we'll be totally there within 20 years, and share it with a time zone that's dark in another part of the world. And it's dark and there's wind in another part of the world, in that time zone, they send it back to us. It forces sharing. So we don't need big military establishments as we had to protect fossil fuels, which are only found in few places. And now solar and wind is the cheapest energy, way cheaper than any other energy. And it's distributed so everybody can be part of the infrastructure. If you have a solar panel or a small wind turbine, you're the infrastructure. If you have an edge data center, not a big centralized data center, you can platform that, you are the infrastructure. If you have a battery or a fuel cell for storage, you are the infrastructure. If you have an electric vehicle and can send power back to the grid, you're the infrastructure. So we're going from these big centralized infrastructures with giant corporations, a handful of them, to millions of small and medium-sized enterprises, localized, who are fluid and agile and can come and go as the climate demands. It's a big change. So where do we go from here? I think the most important part of the book is probably section 3 of the 4 sections, and that's the section where we rethink our concept of selfhood, what we call the autonomous self. We've come to think in the age of progress that each of us is an autonomous agent. We compete with everyone else. We need to be self-sustainable and not beholden to others, and be able to make our life as we can as a competitor with everyone else, as long as we don't endanger them. That isn't the way a human being is arranged. Let me tell you something that will surprise everybody at this book fair. The National Institutes of Health, all right, the premier scientific body in the world, in Washington, they have a new project called the Human Biome Project. They are now telling us that the human being is an ecosystem. This is not a metaphor. We are literally an ecosystem. What does that mean? Every moment of the day and night, there is water from the hydrosphere that's coming into our body in the molecules, and then it's making everything work throughout the body, and then it leaves and goes back to nature. We have the elements from the lithosphere. For example, the phosphorus, which came from the mountains, which were degraded by the waters, which became the sediment. And then all of those elements, not just phosphorus, are taken up by the plants, and the animals eat the plants, and then these elements come into us. This phosphorus started in mountains. When we're done, it goes somewhere else. And then we're learning that our bodies are replaced. The mature human body is about 10 years old, because it's all the body parts are coming and going back to other parts of our ecosystems and our biosphere and our atmosphere and lithosphere. For example, the skeleton, the human skeleton, it's replaced every 10 years. The liver is replaced every year. The stomach cells every month or so. Now, the only things we retain is our teeth until we're dead, and some of our nerve cells in our brain, and the cells in our lens. Everything else is coming and going. And then it gets even more strange. We're not alone in our body, friends. There are all sorts of other creatures living in our body that we're just barely understanding and learning. There's a huge ecosystem in our body, a micro ecosystem. There are protists and archaea and fungi and bacteria and viruses, trillions of them in our bodies. And they are part of our ecosystem, and over half the cells in the human body are not human cells. They belong to all these other creatures. And even though there are 20,000 human genes in our body, there are millions and millions of other genes that belong to these other organisms. We're just barely understanding now that we are a medium, we are an ecosystem, we are a semi-permeable membrane, and all of nature is coming into us for a moment of time so that we can maintain ourselves. Then it's leaving and going somewhere else. We are the ecosystem. There's no such thing as civilization and nature, or culture and the environment. And this is the great separation that started with the book of Genesis and ended up with the age of progress. We are the dominators of the earth, and we control the planet. We now know that's not true. This should be pretty comforting for a younger generation to know that actually we are an ecosystem within ecosystems, and we are embedded in this bigger life force that generates everything on this earth. That's extremely comforting. Now we're frightened to death of nature, and we're retreating indoors. Pretty soon they want to retreat into the metaverse with little pixels on a screen. We can't be frightened. The planet's rewilding, and we're part of it. So we have to reacquaint ourselves with the environment of which we are part of, and we have to reaffiliate. And so the Gen Z generation is pretty interesting here. They went out on protests on these Friday for Future experiments, peaceful, millions of kids, 143 countries, and they did something that we've never seen in history with protests. They saw themselves as an endangered species, all the other divisions that divide us over history, gone. They actually see themselves as a species endangered, and our fellow creatures as part of the evolutionary family. This is probably the biggest change in consciousness that we've seen in 10,000 years, last 10,000 years. The question is, how then do we allow this to evolve? How do we become back and reaffiliate with the natural world? This takes me to how we have to change governance. You know, climate disasters don't give a damn about political boundaries. When a flood hits, or a wildfire, or a drought, or a hurricane, it crosses all the political boundaries. So we're beginning to realize we have to have a new form of governance. We're not going to give up nation states and regions and municipalities, but we have to have bioregional governance now, so that across political boundaries we can steward our common ecosystem, prepare, rescue, and restore during climate events, and then create resilient infrastructures for the future, but it has to be across ecosystems. This is the one place where America's ahead of Europe and China. Everywhere else, Europe and China are pretty well leading. We have two formal bodies doing this. They're huge. We have all of the states in the Pacific Northwest, 5 states, and Canadian provinces across continental boundaries that for 25, 30 years they have had a formal bioregional governance called Cascadia. They actually steward their ecosystems collectively. We have another one in the Great Lakes. Those lakes are 20% of all the remaining fresh water in the earth, right there. So the 8 U.S. states and the 2 Canadian provinces have something called the Great Lakes St. Lawrence bioregion. They actually govern their region for their economies and for their societies as an eco-region. China just did the same. They just announced in September the ecology ministry with 16 other ministries, 8 bioregions. Europe hasn't done that yet. So while we're ahead in Europe in some things, moving toward a resilient society, and in China, it's interesting the U.S. in this one regard is moving forward. But it's not just enough to have bioregions. You know, when climate events occur, everybody comes out. Local governments aren't enough. And even the military now is spending more time in preparing, rescuing, restoring, and making resilient bioregional infrastructure than they are in preparing for war. And that's going to change dramatically. Because we don't need these big militaries, because we're not going to have to protect those small deposits of fossil fuels. There's the sun shines everywhere. The wind blows everywhere. But when there's a climate event, governments they don't have enough manpower, woman power. So everybody comes out. The health clinics, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the students, the churches, the mosques, the temples, the synagogues, the food kitchens, and they're all there. But now we have to formalize them in citizens' assemblies so that we can have an ongoing new distributed form of governance that extends out from cities, seated by cities, to do this. Now, we already do this when it comes to juries. In my country and some other countries, every year, 8 million or so people are called up for jury duty. And 1.8 million people are in juries. And these 12 men and women have to deal with the most complex crimes and civil crimes and bodily crimes and come to a unanimous verdict. And you know what? It works. Almost all the time it works. So we're going to need bioregional governance, and we're going to need citizens' assemblies. We're going to have to change our concepts of science. Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, he said, man was not made for the earth was made for man. So he went with the theme that instead of adapting our species to nature, which is the temporal orientation of every species, including our own until 10,000 years ago, he said adapt nature to us. Efficiency, no more adaptivity. So what happened here? What happened is, he said, we're going to set up something called the scientific inquiry. We will detach ourselves from nature, and as a rational, detached observer, we will study nature inductively and deductively to wrest its secrets so that we can adapt it to our utilitarian needs. Then we wonder why we're in an extinction event. There is a new approach to science. It's very heartening. It's emerging all over the world. It's called complex, adaptive, social, ecological systems modeling, CASES, C-A-S-E-S. And scientists now are coming together across all the disciplines, the social sciences, the natural sciences, and they're beginning to work across their disciplines in order to understand how this complex live planet operates, not so they can preempt it and tame it to us, but so that we can know at each moment, as everything around us is changing in the ecosystems and the spheres, we can temporally adapt, anticipate and temporally adapt, anticipate and temporally adapt. It is interesting to note that Mr. Guterres, who got up in front of the UN, the General Secretary of the UN, at the 27th Climate Conference, and you know what he said? We're in trouble. We're going over 1.5 degrees Celsius. We could go over 2. we've got to begin to realize that we're in big trouble. And what he said is, what we need to do is have a second accompanying narrative. And he called it adaptivity and resilience. It's just nobody's filled it in. So what I hope we can begin to do is have a conversation about all of this playbook that has to be changed. And finally, we have to change education. Our youngsters, when they're little babies and toddlers, they empathize with nature. They have a biophilic attachment. When 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds dream, 60% of their dreams are about other animals, baby animals. When they get to school, they learn that nature is just passive resources. It's waste until we add human labor. That's it. So in my country, 8 of the 12 biggest public school systems with millions of students have introduced ecology as a framing reference for all the other academic disciplines. And the students in grade school and high school have to go in the community as part of their learning, and they have to become eco-stewards. They clean up the waste in the local ecosystem. They take care of animals that need care. They monitor the carbon footprint. All of these things they're learning so that when they become adults, they can be picked for citizens' assemblies, and they can help monitor and steward their local ecosystem. This new age we're going into is unbelievable amount of jobs and new businesses for eco-stewardship. There is no computer or AI or algorithm can handle eco-stewardship. It's too complicated. No robots can do that. It's going to require millions of very sophisticated people using critical systems theory, skilled and unskilled, to be able to steward our ecosystems and give us a second chance by a whole species adapting back to nature rather than nature adapting to us. This is the agenda that we have to do. I'm guardedly hopeful, but I'm not naive. It's going to be up to the Gen Z, the millennials, this younger generation, to begin to pursue this beyond protests. Protests are still important. You have to get into political office. You have to create the new businesses. You have to create the new jobs. You have to be engaged in eco-stewardship. We have to see that a new life is possible. Not growth, but flourishing. Not productivity, but regenerativity. Not GDP, but quality of life indicators. So I'm hoping that this new narrative is not difficult to understand. Everything in the book that I wrote is actually happening. It's not my ideas up in my head. Now we have to scale it. So I'm hoping that in Italy, which has always been a first mover, the Renaissance being the best example, or the creation of the European Union, it was Spinelli, the Italian Spinelli, who envisioned it. We now need to have in Italy and Europe envision a shift from a dying age of progress to a birthing age of resilience, and from efficiency to adaptivity, and from productivity to regenerativity, and create a new future that allow your children and generations to come to experience the wonder of this earth. We're looking out there in telescopes in the universe, it's all dark. We've got an experiment here that's impressive, and we need to pass it on so future generations, not only our species, but other species, can have their moment to feel the fullness of life in the universe. Thank you for giving me some time. I'm hoping that all my friends in Italy will be there at the front lines as first movers, and especially the young people in the millennial and Gen Z generation. This is the time, this is the critical moment to save the planet and our species and fellow creatures. Thank you for allowing me to spend some minutes with you.